I'm going to talk about structures and agents in the Russo-Ukrainian War. Structures and agents are a theoretical construct with considerable practical importance in how we understand the origins of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Social scientists think of structures as unchanging constraints on the behavior of actors. Right? That's the idea of structure. Agents, in contrast, are actors who have some range of choice in responding to structural conditions. In international politics, we think of anarchy as the most important structure. That is, there is no central government or police force, and this leaves states potentially vulnerable to being attacked. This, especially in realist international relations theory, requires states to pursue military power and to be highly sensitive to the distribution of military power. In this view, the agents, states in this case, have very little choice in the matter. And so to explain their behavior, which is to pursue power, we don't really need to know much about the states themselves. However, many will argue that while anarchy and the balance of power are important constraints on state behavior, states still have a great deal of agency in choosing how to respond to the situations they face. A long line of research focuses on whether states are revisionist or support the status quo. This, it is argued, determines whether any particular set of international conditions is stable or not. It's easy to see how we might apply this to the Russo-Ukrainian War. Crucially, to the extent that we believe that structures constrain agents, in this case states, it's hard to blame the agents because they had no real choice. And so the structure-agency debate is very closely tied up with questions of blame. To the extent that we blame one state or another for starting the war, we are implicitly arguing that the state in question had a substantial range of options, that structure played a smaller role and agency a bigger one. The connection between structure and agency is clear in arguments about the origins of this war, whether we focus on 2014 or 2022. The view predominant in the West and in Ukraine is that Russia had considerable agency in starting the war. Putin had a wide range of options in 2014 other than seizing Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. And the same was true in 2022. The fact that so many observers, including senior Russian government officials, did not see the full-scale invasion coming until very shortly before it happened is a sign that nearly everyone believed that there were other options and better options for Russia to pursue. There is another view, espoused by the Russian government and by some of its Western defenders, like the American political scientist John Mearsheimer. In this view, Russia had no agency or very little agency. Given actions by the U.S. in Ukraine, Russia had to attack its neighbor. Interestingly, however, the Putin-Mearsheimer argument is not exactly structural. Rather, they see the U.S. as having had a great deal of agency and criticize the U.S. for what it did while assuming that Russia had no agency. A full critique of this view is beyond the scope of this short video, however. It is also important to stress that Ukraine's agency in this process. Following its independence in 1991, Ukraine's leaders were determined to assert and maintain Ukraine's independence from Russia. This was true even of Ukraine's most pro-Russian leaders, Leonid Kuchma and Viktor Yanukovych. There were other options. Ukraine could have taken the path of Belarus, which gradually allowed itself to be brought back in to Russia's fold. Similarly, Russia could have yielded to Russia's interpretation of the Minsk agreements. Or had Ukraine surrendered to Russia in 2022, as many believed it must, the war would have been brief and much less costly. So there's another concept which comes straight from international relations theory that I think has been underemphasized in the discussion of this war. That is the security dilemma. The security dilemma is the idea that states need to acquire weapons and alliances to make themselves secure in a dangerous world, but that doing so makes their neighbors feel less secure. The result is often a spiral of fear and insecurity. In Europe, after the Cold War, the new states of Eastern Europe were insecure. There were old territorial disputes, and all of these countries had recently been occupied by Russia, whose democracy was unstable. The wars in the former Yugoslavia showed all too clearly that post-communist Europe could be a dangerous place. It was only natural that these states would seek external protection for their security, and this came in the form of NATO membership. This, it can be argued, was determined by structure much more than by agency. However, the enlargement of NATO towards Russia was not seen by Russia as improving its security. And while it seems unthinkable to us that NATO would attack Russia, Russians may have felt that NATO expansion still undermined its security, and that it should respond by increasing its efforts to control the region to its west. In this perspective, if there was going to be a line in Europe between a democratic West and a non-democratic East, the only question is where that line would be drawn. Even if neither side were aggressive, I stress that, even if neither side were aggressive, both would want this line to be as far from their own borders as possible. Ukraine was desperate to end up on the western side of this line, but that would put the line on the Russian-Ukrainian border, which of course Russia did not want. The security dilemma is important because it highlights that even if neither the West nor Russia were aggressive, they would still tend to make each other feel threatened. I want to stress that I'm not arguing that Russia was not aggressive or revisionist, only that the situation was much more conflict-prone than many seemed to believe. Interestingly, the key conflict came not over military alliances, but over a trade agreement, the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. Russia believed, correctly in my opinion, that if Ukraine and the EU signed this agreement, Ukraine would be much harder to draw back into the Russian fold. Ukraine believed, and I think they were correct too, that if Ukraine did not sign the association agreement and instead joined the Russia-led customs union, that it would inevitably end up controlled by Russia. Europe was clearly disappointed when it seemed in late 2013 that Ukraine would join Russia. But when that reversed in 2014, Russia wasn't merely disappointed, right? It attacked. Looking at the full-scale invasion of 2022, it's hard to see the role of the security dilemma, and harder not to attribute the invasion to a clear choice made by Russia to escalate the conflict. I want to shift now to the domestic level to discuss the same structure-agency issue at the domestic level. While we think of states as agents acting within the international system, for individual policymakers, the state looks like a structure that constrains the options of the individual leader. We see this most clearly in the discussions the two presidents. We see this most clearly in discussions of the two presidents, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. To what extent do we blame the war on Putin himself rather than on Russia as a whole? And to what extent do we attribute Ukraine's incredible resilience to Zelensky's leadership, especially in the early days of the war? The first question is whether we blame Russia's aggression on the Russian state in general or on Putin himself. For example, is there something about the form of authoritarianism that has taken hold in Russia that makes the state more aggressive? Or is it at least possible that in a less authoritarian Russia, it would be harder for leaders to overcome domestic resistance to war? One of the main arguments of the so-called democratic peace theory is that in some kinds of states, leaders are more tightly constrained from going to war than in other kinds of states. Because so few people in Russia seem to have been aware of plans to go to war in February 2022, it seems like the decision rested largely with Putin himself. In other words, even after the international system and state structures of Russia are taken into account, Putin had considerable latitude either to take the country to war or not. In Ukraine, the questions are slightly different. We can still focus on the role of the president. To what extent was Ukraine's resistance dependent on Zelensky's leadership? Or to what extent was he constrained by the desires of his people to fight? We can only speculate on what might have happened had Zelensky been killed early in the war, or on what might happen in the future if he is killed or removed from power. It's not only the case that the nature of the state shapes leaders' options in fighting the war. Fighting the war also has an immense impact on the nature and evolution of the state. The American political sociologist Charles Tilly famously argued, "War made the state, and the state made war." Tilly's point was that European states developed as they did largely as solutions to the problem of how to pay for, field, and support armies in the early modern era. So today we see evidence of a stronger, more competent Ukrainian state in any number of ways. And just to cite the most obvious example, the competence of the Ukrainian military has increased astonishingly from the early days of the Russian invasion of 2014 until now. So two interesting processes are underway. First, the Ukrainian war effort has been strengthened by, and has also strengthened, the decentralization reform that began in 2014, even though it's also, in some respects, disrupted implementation of that reform. The increased competence of local and regional authorities has been an important source of resilience for Ukraine, and the demands placed on local authorities have increased their competence and people's confidence in them. Second, however, the war has also led to a concentration of power in the national government in some ways. The needs of fighting the war led the parliament to take a backseat to the president and opposition parties to defer to pro-presidential parties. The media have largely come under state control. So a crucial question going forward is whether these emergency measures can be loosened as the war goes on, and whether this centralization of power in the executive branch will be reversed after the war ends. Some of this discussion may seem very theoretical, so I want to close with some very practical implications. First, concerning Vladimir Putin's individual agency. To what extent that we think Putin played a central role in launching the war, there is good news and bad news. The bad news is that as long as Putin remains in power, the war will likely continue. The good news is that in the longer term, peace between Ukraine and Russia would appear possible. Second, concerning the Russian state. If the Russian state is inherently expansionist, then peace is only possible to a very limited extent. One can contain Russia, but not necessarily be friends with it. A different perspective, which held for much of the post-Cold War era, is that Russia could become a different kind of state, a Western-style democracy that accepted international norms and made no territorial claims on its neighbors. Some people inside Russia and outside still believe that this is possible. Third, going back to where we started, at the level of the international system, does the security dilemma condemn Russia and its neighbors to insecurity and rivalry, or can those structural factors be overcome, either with international agreements, such as treaties, or with internal changes within Russia, such as democratization? Is the sort of containment that maintained a basic level of peace during the Cold War the best we can hope for? And is this true regardless of who runs Russia and whether it's democratic? Answering questions such as these will have an important impact on how the West and Ukraine pursue their security after the war. This, in turn, has immense impact on what kind of terms for ending the war will be seen as acceptable. And that then will shape how Ukraine fights the war and how the West supports it. Thank you.